Welcome boys to another video. This is going to be a pretty long video because I'm going to be ranking every single weapon in Hypixel Skyblock. As I am recording this, Hypixel is actually down and the entire server is down due to DDoS attacks. So I am going to have to be using a single player world to do this, but I am using the remake created by Blue Commander, which I will link in the description, and it's going to make this a lot easier. If you do end up enjoying, please consider subscribing, and let's just get right into it. Quickly, let me just tell you what each tier is. So first, there's legit just throw it away, F tier, trash, never buy this, D tier, I guess you could use it, which is C tier, then actually pretty good, no cap, which is B tier, and then grind for this, which is A tier, and S tier is you need this, WTF, it's OP. But now, let's get right into it. So we will start this with the aspect of the Jerry. The aspect of the Jerry is a pretty useless sword, to be honest, and I don't want the Jerry stands to get mad at me. I don't want the people who hate Jerry to get mad at me. So I'll put it right in the middle. I guess you can use this, because I guess you could. The next sword is the Flaming Sword. The Flaming Sword is the sword you get from killing the pigmen in the Nether. It's literally useless. I don't even know why I'm trying to explain it. Yeah, just throw this away. The next sword is the Undead Sword. The Undead Sword is pretty good even if you are a veteran or a new player playing on a completely new profile. The Undead Sword is something you will probably always use. So if you put some decent enchants on this baby and then start doing some zombies, you could get a lot of combat XP very quickly, and it does a pretty good amount of damage for the price. So it's definitely going to be 90% of players' first sword. So I'm going to put it at B because it's a very good sword, but you don't want to grind for it. You don't need to grind for it, and it's not the best sword in the game by any means. So let's put it at B because it's a decent sword. Next is the Fancy Sword. The Fancy Sword is kind of strange. It doesn't really have any place in the game. It has strange enchants and it has a lot of weird behavior. I don't even know why you have it, but like if you do, yeah, just throw it away. It's completely useless in the game. Next is the Silver Fang. The Silver Fang is kind of like the upgrade. Well, not the direct upgrade, but kind of like the next progression after the Undead Sword, but you could really skip it. It's not that much better, and you could easily skip to a way better sword. When the game first came out, it might have been a good sword, but at this point, it really isn't, because the only time I ever used it in progression was on my first profile, which came out like the day the game came out on Hypixel. So really, if you have this, you could basically just throw it in the void or sell it to the bazaar or to the NPC. Next is the Ember Rod. The Ember Rod used to be one of the best swords in the game, but obviously with all the new updates, it's nowhere close, and it was actually removed from the game. This makes it super overpriced to buy one right now, and you could buy so many better weapons with it. So definitely, I'm not going to put this in legit throw it away because it actually has some value, but if you have the money, you should never buy this. Next is the End Sword. The End Sword might seem kind of useless, but it's actually pretty decent. It's way better than the Undead Sword if you're trying to kill Endermen specifically, and at one point it was like the meta for dragons because you could sword swap to it and do a bunch of extra damage. I don't know if it still works or if they patched it, but I still say it's a decent weapon. So I'm going to put it in I guess you could use it because it's not terrible, but you could probably skip any use of this weapon ever because not many people do dragons anymore, let's be honest. Next is the Spider Sword. The Spider Sword is basically the same thing but just for spiders. So you could probably manage with your Undead Sword, but you could also use this if you did really care. So I'll just put in I guess you could use it because you really won't use it in any other circumstance, and it's basically the same to the End Sword but a bit worse. Next is the Rogue Sword, and basically everybody who plays Skyblock knows what the Rogue Sword is. It's really good for getting some movement speed, and Before dungeons, it was kind of useless, but now with dungeons where you need a lot of speed, it's actually very useful. So I'm going to be putting it in S tier. The Hunter Knife is a weapon you get from one of those challenges in the races in the park, and it's kind of useless. The main bonus is that it gives you speed. So it's kind of like the Anduril from UHC, if anyone plays that. So I guess if you ever need some extra speed, it's kind of useful, but other than that, it's not that useful. So I will put it in I guess you could use it, because I guess you could use it in some cases, but really it's kind of useless. Now we have the Recluse Fang. The Recluse Fang is basically the first level of the Slayer weapons for spiders, and it's an upgraded version of the Spider Sword. The Recluse Fang, I'm going to be honest, it's kind of useless. You really shouldn't buy it, and it actually has like a decent amount of coins to be bought. So I would personally not buy it, but you could use it. So I'm going to say trash, never buy this, but technically you could if you really wanted to. But in my opinion, you should never buy it. Now we have the Prismarine Blade. Dude, I literally forgot this weapon exists. I don't know why you would use it. This is definitely going on legit just throwaway. Now we have the Golem Sword. The Golem Sword actually used to be decent. Its ability is actually like halfway decent, and it has decent stats. But right now, you could completely skip it because of dungeons and all the other dungeon weapons you can get. So I'm going to just put this probably in never buy this, because if you have it, you should probably use it. But you really shouldn't try to go and grind for this. It's kind of a useless weapon. Now we have the Raider's Axe, and the Raider's Axe is actually pretty good. It's a pretty good early starting weapon, and it's on par with the AOTE. So I would say it's actually decently good if you are starting off. So if you want a decently cheap and good weapon, I would say get this. So I'm definitely going to put this in grind for this, because it's a pretty good weapon to have. Now we have one of the most well-known items in the game, the Aspect of the End. The Aspect of the End is the weapon that allows you to teleport, and it's one of the most useful weapons in the entire game, and also serves as a pretty decent starting game weapon. So if you're doing any killing in any part of the game, it's actually a pretty decent weapon at the very early game. So Aspect of the End all around is a great weapon, so I'm definitely putting this in S tier. Next we have Aspect of the Dragons. Aspect of the Dragons is the weapon that drops from any dragon and sells for about 1 to 2 million coins. I haven't checked in a decently long time, but it is a decent weapon. With all the new dungeon weapons, you can probably skip it completely, so it's not something you really want to grind for. But if you do end up getting one or decide to buy one, it's actually decently good, so we'll put it in B tier. So next we have the Revenant Falchion. The Revenant Falchion, as most of you probably know, is the upgrade to the Undead Sword, and is the first zombie slayer sword that you should probably start using. I think the Revenant Falchion is actually very good, because if you can grind yourself to level 3 and then buy one of these when you're really low combat level, it makes grinding crypt ghouls a lot easier. And in my playthrough on my new profile that I recently made for Speedrun to Hyperion, a Revenant Falchion actually came in pretty handy. So I'm going to put this at actually pretty good, no cap, because that's what it is. Next is the Shaman Sword. The Shaman Sword is like kinda decent, but it's really not that good, and for it to be good for you, you need to have Mastiff armor. So I would personally think that you would have a better like damaging weapon other than a Shaman Sword when you are like in need to use this, because you need to have Mastiff. So I would personally say you should probably not get it, but it's really up to you. So I'm just gonna say I guess you could use this. Next we have the Voodoo Doll. The Voodoo Doll is actually like kinda cool. It's a pretty cool weapon, and it has like a pretty unique ability, but it's really not useful in many cases. There was recently a way to use it to do a lot of damage on mini bosses in dungeons, but other than that, it's pretty much a useless pet item. So I'm probably just gonna end up saying that you should probably never buy this. Next, we have the Pigment Sword. The Pigment Sword used to be one of the best swords in the entire game, and everyone wanted one, but right now it's pretty much useless. There's so many outclassing swords for way cheaper, and because of other uses of enchanted pork and enchanted grilled pork, the prices on these are still really expensive, even though they are not worth the price at all. At one point they were good because of the ability that let you basically destroy in dungeons, but then they added a cooldown, so now it's basically a useless weapon. If you have one, obviously keep using it if you don't have anything better, but if you don't have one, you should be thinking, trash, never buy this. Next, we have the Endstone Sword, which is a pretty cool sword. Not many people really care for its damage or strength, but more its ability, which allows you to basically get permanent not permanent, but damage resistance for 5 seconds that in most cases will just make you invincible. It's actually really good in my opinion, and I think it's actually a weapon like a lot of players use no matter their level. So I'm not gonna say you want to grind for it, but it actually is pretty good, no cap, and it requires very little to buy or craft. So I'm gonna put it right here. Next, we have the Ghoul Buster, and if you don't know what that is, no worries, because I didn't know what it was either until I looked into all the different weapons. Yeah, so this weapon is kind of useless. Like, this is not even the most effective way to get candy, and I guess you could use it if you're like an Iron Man or something, but to be honest, I don't really find it that useful, and I think it has a decent price tag, so I'm gonna put it at trash, never buy this. Finally, we have the Tactician Sword, which used to be one of the best swords in the game when you put wood singularity and recommed it and put a bunch of hot potatoes and stuff, but after all the new dungeon items came out, it's really not that good. So I'm gonna say that it's probably an item that I guess you could use this, like if you're coming back from playing a long time ago and you have one, definitely use it, but you're gonna want to upgrade pretty soon. Now we've got the Pooch Sword, and the Pooch Sword is the upgraded version of the Shaman Sword. And to be honest, if you can afford one of these, you can afford some other decently damaging sword like a Livid Dagger or a Flower of Truth. So to be honest, this sword is kind of useless. You really shouldn't buy this, so I'm gonna put it in you should never buy this, like the other sword. Next, we have the Ink Wand, and the Ink Wand is kind of useless. It's just a wand that shoots ink that does magic scale damage. So I would say it's okay, but it's really not that good, and its cooldown is so high that there's not many reasons you would ever use this. So I think it sells for a decent amount because of collectors or something, but if you ever think of buying this, it's probably not worth it. So we're gonna put it in trash, never buy this. Next, we have the Emerald Blade, which is a pretty renowned sword in the community and is also a pretty good sword as well. The Emerald Blade does a good amount of damage if you have the coins for it, but at a lower amount of coins, it's not too good. If you have around 50 mil, it's actually decent. So I would personally say the Emerald Blade is actually decently good. So I don't know where I will put this because it depends on where you are in the game and how many coins you have. But I'll put it at around actually good, no cap, because it's not terrible, but it's not godly if you're not rich already. So now we are on to the dungeon items, or the ones that has a main purpose that has something to relate to dungeons. So first we have the Bonzo Staff, which is a pretty good mage weapon for early game players, and its main thing that it is being used for now is in floor 7, because a lot of people are using it to basically traverse the rooms in the boss room for floor 7. So in terminals, it makes it really good to use because of the knockback from the balloons. and it's also good in the first boss room just to get the crystals, because you can boost yourself really far with it. So I would say this is a very good all-around weapon because it's good at the beginning and then better at the end game. So I'm definitely going to put this at A tier. Next we have the Conjuring, which is basically a pretty useless weapon, but its ability is so useful. Even though it seemed like it just reduces the cooldown of Guided Sheep, it is actually bugged and gives you Guided Sheep when you right click it whenever you have it, no matter your class. For people who aren't mages, this is so useful. So for me, who plays Berserker and Archer on my different profiles, this is so useful because it basically gives me free Infiniboom TNT, because this thing never runs out and it's only like a 30-second cooldown for like instant Super Boom TNT. So I really like this, and it's also decent, I guess, if you are playing mage, but definitely if you're any other class, you need this if you're playing dungeons and you want to learn secrets fast. Next we have the Earth Shard, which I think was decent at one point, but with all the new dungeon items and stuff, it really isn't used at all. I guess it seems decent, but it really isn't that good, and it's mainly a tank weapon, and there's a bunch of better weapons for tanks. So to be honest, I'm gonna just say throw it away when you get one. Next up we have the Fel Sword. The Fel Sword is actually pretty decent. I don't know if it was patched, but it's a pretty decent sword from its stats, and it is also pretty cheap. So I'm gonna be putting this probably at actually pretty good, no cap, but you're gonna upgrade from it very quickly if you're doing any decent amount of dungeons. Finally, we have the Adaptive Blade, which, to be honest, at the beginning of dungeons where floor 3 was the only like highest dungeon you could do, it definitely was good, but at this point there's so many other dungeons you can do and so many better swords because of it, that the Adaptive Blade is basically shadowed by all of them. I really don't know when in the game you would ever use it, and especially if you're an archer, I have zero idea for when you would use it. So I'm going to be saying that this is probably something that is trash and you should never buy it. Next we have the Silent Death, which is basically one of those other random dungeon swords that just drop on the floor. Its ability is pretty cool, but not too useful. I think the main thing people use it for is basically like doing some cheeses, which I really don't understand completely, but I don't even know if it works well with those. So to be honest, this is probably one of the weapons that you just want to throw away. Next, we got the Florid Zombie Sword, which is so good for dungeons. If you're doing dungeons or even like Enderman Slayer or anything, a zombie sword, specifically the Florid Zombie in this case, it's so good because it heals you so much, and while it is decently expensive, it's really worth it if you're going to be doing a lot of dungeons. So I'm definitely going to be putting this in A tier, because if you don't have a Florid Zombie Sword, you should definitely grind the money to go and get yourself one. Next we have the Yeti Sword. The Yeti Sword used to be one of the best dungeon weapons in the game, which kind of sounds like a little strange, but its ability was pretty good for dungeons, and it was basically a long range Midas Staff, or basically any long-range mage weapon of choice for most players before like floor 4, I think. So it was actually a pretty good weapon, but then people stopped using it after all the new mage weapons came out. So I'll just put it, I guess you could use it, because that's what I would think when I see someone using this. Next we have the Zombie Commander Whip, which I don't even know what this is. Like, I don't even remember this being in the game. So legit, just throw this thing away. Next, we have the Spirit Scepter. The Spirit Scepter was one of the best mage weapons when floor 4 came out, and now it's a decent mage weapon, but it's not obviously the best. I don't know if you should really grind for it, but I think it is still pretty good. So I think I might just put it in A tier because it is a very good clearing weapon for low level mages. Next we have the lower level Cleavers. These used to actually be used in dungeons, but after a while people just stopped using them. I remember a lot of healers used to use these, and I'm assuming it was for like terracotta phase in floor 6, but after a while people just stopped using these with new metas being out and with newer players being able to utilize new metas. So I really think all of these can be skipped, and in my playthrough on a new profile I completely forgot these items exist, so I'm gonna be honest, these are pretty trash. So for the super cleaver, I guess we can put it in, I guess you could use because it's so cheap. Then for the hyper cleaver, I guess you could put it there as well, but for the giant cleaver, really you should just never buy this. So next, I kind of forgot a few of the non-dungeon swords, so let's just get these pretty fast. So we have the scorpion foil, which is basically just the sword to kill spiders, and I guess it's pretty good, but it's not the best, so we'll just put it in B tier. Actually pretty good. Then we have the Sword of Revelations. The Sword of Revelations was really good before because it could make it really easy to start doing Diana, but with all the strength nerfs, it's still not the best, to be honest. But because it doesn't have a huge reliance on strength, it's still a pretty good sword for doing Diana if you have the gear for it. So I'm gonna put it in actually pretty good. No. Going back to the dungeon items, the Leaping Sword and Silk-Edged Sword, which are both upgrades of each other, are actually pretty good. Not for the damage at all, but it is actually pretty good for its ability that basically allows you to lock these opponents in the air and basically stun lock them. The Silk-Edged Sword does have a better version of the ability, so it is kinda worth it to upgrade, but it's very expensive because it's basically just double the price of the Leaping Sword to get one Silk-Edged Sword. So I don't know completely if it's worth it if you're early game, but I know a few late game players do use it in like master mode or did use it at some point. So I'm gonna be putting the Silk-Edged Sword at, I guess you could use, or nah, I'll put both of these in pretty good no cap because they pretty much are. Next, we have the Zombie Soldier Cutlass. It seems like a pretty bad weapon, but it actually has a place in the progression for Skyblock when you're a pretty low dungeon player. The fact that it's a pretty decent dungeon sword for cheap and its ability gives you some health on a hit, it's basically free lifesteal and decent damage when you're really new to dungeons. So obviously this is not a weapon you really need to grind for, but it is actually pretty good, so we'll put it in actually pretty good, no cap. Next, we have the Dreadlord Sword. The Dreadlord Sword is a decent sword with a decent ability, I'd say, but it's mainly a mage weapon, but the ability isn't that good. I think you can move on to way better mage weapons earlier, so I really don't know why you would use this, but you can obviously try it if you would like, but it's not that good in my opinion. So I'm gonna put it in, I guess you could use it. Next, we have the Spirit Sword. The Spirit Sword is actually pretty nice because it stays in your inventory when you die in a dungeon, which is actually pretty cool, but it really isn't the biggest thing, and it's just something that is nice to have, but really not needed. It actually has a pretty hefty price tag, so if you are thinking of going and grinding for it, you really shouldn't. So to be honest, I think I'm going to be putting this in, I guess you could use it, since it's not that good, but if you have one, it's not terrible to use. Now we have some of those new Atom Split and Vorpal Katanas because I forgot to put these in. I didn't include the first one because it's kind of trash and it really needed to be on this tier list, but instead I got the Atom Split and the Vorpal. So the Vorpal Katana is actually a pretty decent sword. It is around a bit better than the Giant Sword because its ability is so good. So I'm gonna actually rank this pretty high, and if you're trying to do those Enderman Slayers, you should actually grind for this weapon. Next, we have the Daedalus Axe. The Daedalus Axe is one of the best swords in the game, mainly just for its magic find if you put Chimera 5 on it and you use the Black Cat pet, I think. Other than that, not many people use it in other cases, but recently people have been using it to do Griffin more because it actually outclasses the normal Sword of Revelations by a lot due to the strength nerfs. So it's actually a pretty good sword to have if you do like doing that event. And if you really got the money and you want really high magic find, it's also very good to use. So I'm definitely going to put this in grind for this. Next, we have the Shadow Fury, which is a dungeon weapon that's somewhat expensive. It's a decent amount expensive and it's a pretty good sword, to be honest, but it really isn't used as a sword and mainly for its ability, which allows you to do a bunch of cheeses. I don't know how fair these cheeses are, but I know a lot of people use them to cheese stuff, so it's actually a decent weapon in that case. But other than that, I don't see too many people using it. So it's obviously not the best weapon, but it is a pretty decent weapon to have. So I'll put it in actually pretty good no cap. Next, we've got the Necromancer Sword. The Necromancer Sword as an actual sword, to be honest, it's not that good and no one uses it as an actual sword. But if you are trying to do the new Enderman Slayer and you want a cheap way to use this sword to get souls, it's definitely a very good option. The only other ways are through summoning rings and through the Reaper Scythe, and because of the Enderman update, those items have been inflated for a bit. So if you ever want a cheap way to get it, you can use the Necromancer Sword, but you do have to kill them with the sword. One good tip is if you have another weapon like the summoning ring in your inventory, the souls will drop just when you kill anything with any weapon, and then you can pick it up with the Necromancer Sword. So if you want to, you can borrow someone's and fill it up your Necromancer Sword very easily like that. Other than that, it's kind of a useless sword, so I'm going to be putting it in actually pretty good no cap. Next, we have the Edible Mace, which actually used to be a very good weapon because of mace swapping, where you would basically use it to double your damage on all your hits, and it was very good for a bunch of dungeons. But after a bunch of the sword swapping nerfs, it's become pretty useless, to be honest. There's not many instances where you would use it other than for maybe like a damage test or something, but it isn't terrible. It's kind of lost its place in the meta, so I'm going to be putting this in C tier for I guess you could use it. Next, we have the Midas Sword, which used to be one of the best swords in the entire game, and we're just going to consider this as the 50 mil Midas Sword because, let's be honest, you shouldn't be using any other sword that isn't 50 mil. And if you're using the 50 mil Midas Sword, to be honest, there's a bunch of better swords that you could use instead, like the Livid Dagger or even a Flower of Truth. I personally think it's basically useless, and if you ever think of buying it, you should completely rethink your idea. So I'm going to be putting this in trash, never buy. Next, we have the Withercloak Sword, which is another one of those swords that are used mainly for the ability and not the sword itself or its damage. So if you have this sword, you need it in floor 7 because it's so useful when you're running around in floor 7 and you want to make sure that you don't take too much damage from the lava. Especially if you're a newer player who can't really tank, it's definitely a good sword for you. And trust me, if you have a tank, they will love you for having this sword because they will take so much less damage if you're using this. So I'm definitely going to be putting this in grind for this if you do not have one already. Next, we have the Phantom Rod. It's a pretty decent weapon. It's not that useful in any circumstance, but it's obviously not terrible. So its only real use case is for the Arachne boss, but in some new mobs it usually becomes decently useful. So I'm going to be putting this in C tier for I guess you could use this. Next, we have the Ice Spray Wand. The Ice Spray Wand is actually pretty good for dungeons, especially master mode, because the mobs do so much damage, and especially the mini bosses because it helps so much in killing them because they are so strong. So definitely every dungeon sweat should have this, and in other floors it's kind of useful, not needed but useful. So definitely if you want to go very far in dungeons, you need to get one. So I'm going to put this in grind for this, or A tier. Next, we have the Frozen Scythe, which is generally just a very good weapon in all of Skyblock, outside and inside of dungeons. Outside of dungeons, it's good for just killing mobs like zealots or endermen or anything like that, and inside of dungeons it's decently good for clearing, and it's pretty cheap as well. I remember that my brother used to use this as his main mage weapon when he started dungeons, so I'm definitely saying that this is a decent weapon. So I'm going to be putting this in actually pretty good no cap, because it is. Now we have a pretty controversial one, which is Livid Dagger versus Flower of Truth. and I'm gonna be honest, I think the Flower of Truth is better. Here's why. The Livid Dagger, better outside of dungeons because it has attack speed and decent damage and all that stuff. So it's definitely better outside of dungeons. But inside of dungeons, the Flower of Truth is so much better, especially if you're early game, because having this and putting Withered on it gives you so much strength that even after the nerf is really decent for damage and especially good for EHP. So I'm gonna be honest, I'm gonna actually put this in S tier because this is the reason I was able to go from Cata 0 to 24 on a new profile in less than 130 hours. So this is definitely something I would say is the best weapon in the game. For the reasons I just explained, I can't put this on the tier of Flower of Truth, but it's still a very good weapon, so I'm going to be putting this at A tier for grind for this. Next is the Midas Staff, which is pretty much a pretty good weapon for mages because of its ability. No one cares about its actual strength and damage, but for its ability it's actually pretty good, and it can be used to do floor 7s pretty well if you do want to start doing floor 7s and don't have something like a Hyperion. The only thing that I really don't like about it is that it has a cooldown and it's really mana consuming, so you can't spam it as much, but it's still a very good weapon. Another huge bonus of this is that you don't need 100 mil for it to be good. Like the Midas, unlike the Midas Sword, you need like 50 mil for it to be decent. This has a different scaling, which makes it so that it's actually kind of good even at like a decently low price, and the 100 mil is for like the sweatiest of the sweat. So you can actually get a pretty decent one for maybe even 20 mil and do a lot of damage. So I'm definitely going to be putting this on grind for this because it's not S tier, but it's really good still. Next, we have the Giant Sword. The Giant Sword doesn't have any strength, and because of the strength nerf, it makes this sword probably really good and one of the best swords in the game because of all other swords getting completely nerfed to the ground because of the strength nerf. But this has 0 strength, making it just as good as before, basically just buffing it and making all those other swords way worse than it. So it's definitely a very OP sword, and if you do not have the money for an Emerald Blade, I would definitely recommend you getting this because it's about 100 mil and it has the value of like a 600 or 500 mil Emerald Blade. So unless you have a buttload of money, you should definitely get this. Next, we have the Soul Whip, which is a pretty good sword outside and inside of dungeons, and because of its pretty decent damaging and damage. Next, we have the Soul Whip, which is a very good decently damaging long range weapon outside and inside of dungeons. With the bones and stuff getting nerfed, this is actually a pretty decent long range weapon even for archers before the introduction of the Juju short bow, but before that, a lot of people were actually using this. So I'm definitely gonna say it's pretty good, but it's not something that you should particularly grind for unless you really want to do ghosts. So I'm going to be putting this in actually pretty good no cap. Next, we have the Axe of the Shredded, which is a very good weapon to be honest. It's very good outside of dungeons for doing Zombie Slayer and inside of dungeons because so many of the mobs are zombies and because of its really good ability. So this is definitely an all-around really good weapon if you're a Berserker, and outside of dungeons it's good if you want to start doing some Zombie Slayers. So I'm definitely going to be putting this in A tier. Next is the Jerry Sheen Gun. The Jerry Sheen Gun was an S tier for me, but then it got killed by the nerf, and it's really bad for any player that isn't a top level mage, and it is decent for them only because I think they may be able to do the floor 7 crystals with it, but otherwise it's really not useful in any other circumstances because of its incredibly high mana cost. So I'm going to be putting it in actually pretty good no cap because it's just good, but it's not that good. Next, we got the swords everyone was waiting for, the Necron Blade. So the Necron Blade is just the unrefined version of the Hyperion, the Valkyrie, the Scylla, and the Astrea. So I don't know why you would use it, but it's not terrible, I think. So I think this is the reason this tier exists. So I guess you could use it. Now for the refined version. We all know that if you slap some scrolls on these, all of these are always going to be in S tier. But which are the best out of them? So first, I would definitely say Scylla's the worst because it's meant for archers, but archers literally use bows. Why would they use a sword? So definitely going to be putting this as the worst one. Then we have the Astrea, which is actually decent for getting a lot of defense and tanking. And I've seen some people actually use it like unironically just because it's a decent sword. So I'm going to be putting this right over Scylla. Then the Valkyrie, definitely a very good damaging sword as well as having a very good ability. So I'm definitely going to be putting this above these two. But we all know Hyperion is one of the biggest swords in the game. Everyone knows it. People who don't even play Skyblock are starting to learn about it. And it's just a really good weapon, especially if you're doing dungeons. So I'm definitely going to be putting this as the best one out of all four because this is so good for clearing in any floor. So this is the final tier list, and it's not in any order like from the rows because that would take me way too long and I'm really lazy. So this is what we have gotten, and if you just skipped here to see what I got, here is what I got. So this was my tier list for every weapon in Hypixel Skyblock, and I might have missed a few weapons here and there, but I really don't care. So GGL, and hopefully by the time this video is out, Hypixel is back up.
Pharmacy.